Welcome to our next lesson for second semester Greek. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at two new tense forms, that of the perfect tense form and the pluperfect tense form. As you can see from our chart here, that brings us to the last of the tense forms that we'll be learning, in fact, the last that exist within Koine Greek, the perfect and pluperfect tense forms in the far left column. And to this point, we've only learned the indicative mood for each of these tenses, but in the next lesson or two, we'll be learning about the subjunctive and optative moods, as well as the imperative mood. And that will cover everything as far as verbs are concerned for Greek. So we've come a long way in terms of our understanding of Greek verbs, and even recently learning in the last couple of lessons about participles. There is going to be a perfect participle form that we'll learn in this lesson. However, there will not be a pluperfect form, just as there wasn't for the imperfect tense. So even though there are 6 verb tense forms in Greek, there are only 4 participle tense forms. Before we look at the function of the perfect tense form, let's just look at how it is composed. It's made up of 4 parts. You'll see, of course, the stem there with lu from luo, but it also has preceding that as a prefix, a reduplication of the stem. And usually what happens with the perfect tense form is you'll have the consonant that begins the stem, that is reduplicated, lambda in this case, and then there's a verb that is supplied to connect the two, the epsilon in this case, leluka. One of the parts of the perfect tense active voice indicative mood verb is also the tense sign of kappa for the perfect tense. We saw sigma for the aorist tense. Kappa is going to distinguish the perfect active. And then, of course, you've got the ending, the alpha. So put it together, you've got leluka, which is the perfect active indicative first person singular form of luo. One thing you'll notice as you work with perfect tense verbs is the reduplication of the stem. Now, we've seen in the previous slide the norm, and that would be for the consonant of a verb that begins, in this case, like with lambda, for that to be reduplicated with leluka. But there are other instances where you have verbs that begin with other letters, such as phi, theta, or chi, and sometimes they are changed into smoother sounding consonants for the reduplication, such as p or tau or kappa. For thnesko, which is I die, and it's changed into tethnika, and so you can see the theta changes to the tau. But sometimes you have a verb that begins with a vowel, like here we have elpidzo, I hope, and it's changed in the perfect tense form into elpika, and you can see that there's been a lengthening of that vowel. Or if a verb begins with a diphthong, you have the same situation. It will entail a lengthening. And we saw that the same thing occurs with the aorist tense, so you just have to watch for that. And one distinction you'll be able to make to distinguish an aorist from a perfect is elpika. You see the kappa in the middle of the word. That's the perfect tense sign, and that tells you it's perfect, not aorist. And sometimes you have, as far as reduplication goes, the beginning double consonant for a verb such as gnosko. Now you'll notice the iota in between the gamma and the nu, but when it comes to the root form for that word, or the stem I should say, it's just gamma nu, as in the perfect tense form, egnoka, egnoka. And when that's the case, when you have a gamma and a nu like that together, or 2 consonants, or even a row that begins the verb, then what will happen is oftentimes there'll be an epsilon added. And when that happens, it almost looks like an augment. So you think that you might be dealing with, say, an imperfect tense verb, but that's not the case. This is actually still a perfect tense verb, egnoka. So quite a bit different from the example we saw with luo and leluka. And then there are also instances where you have a compound verb that's made up of a preposition that prefixes the verb, in this case apostello, I send away is the idea, similar to the noun for apostle, a sent one who is sent away. But here you have the prefix, the preposition apa, and then you've got stello. You put it together, and when it's a compound like that, there'll be, again, an augment, or something that looks like an augment that's actually not. In this case, apestelka, apestelka. So it changes. But again, you can notice that it is a perfect tense when you see the kappa in the middle of the word. Now let's look at our paradigm for the perfect active indicative of luo. And you'll notice here, this is, by the way, for the first perfect form. There's also a second perfect active indicative, which we'll look at next. But for the first perfect form of luo, you have the le, the reduplication there. Lu is the stem. Kappa is the perfect tense sign. And then the endings, a, as, e, or en in some cases, third person singular, first person plural, amen, or ate, or asi, or asin, and third person plural. You also have an alternate form of an ending, lelukan instead of lelukasi or sin. And so just note that there's an alternative ending in this case. By the way, these are the same endings that you will see as the first aorist active indicative forms. And how would we translate the perfect active indicative? Again, we don't have context here, so it's a little difficult to say this is exactly how it should be translated, but we'll just take a stab at it. You would translate leluka, I have loosed. And the perfect tense, as we'll see, deals with an action in past time that is complete, and it results in a present state. And sometimes the emphasis is on the past action that is complete, and sometimes the emphasis is on the present existing state. But for simplicity's sake, let's just get in the habit of translating these for our paradigm here. I have loosed, you have loosed, he, she, or it has loosed. We have loosed, you have loosed, they have loosed. So you'll want to supply the words have or has. I mentioned there was a second perfect active indicative, in this case of lepo, not luo, lepo, I leave. And in this case, what we see is, again, the reduplication of the stem. So it's le that prefixes loi. Notice there's been a change in the word from le, lambda epsilon iota, to lambda omicron iota. So there's been a stem change, but it's prefixed by the reduplication. And in this case, the kappa is absent. That is one thing that you'll notice with second perfect active indicatives. They do not have the kappa perfect sign. And then you've got the same endings as with the first perfect active indicative, which happen to be the same as the first aorist active indicative. Having looked at the perfect active indicative forms, let's move on now to perfect middle and passive indicative paradigms, going back to luo in this case. We see in the upper left corner the first person singular, lelumai, and you will notice the reduplication again, lel, and in this case the kappa, which is the perfect tense sign for the active voice, has dropped out. You won't find that with the middle and passive indicative mood forms. So that's an interesting observation to make and a significant difference. You'll notice as well that the endings look very familiar. Lelumai, lelusai, lelutai, lelumetha, lelustha, and leluntai. Those endings are the same as the middle and passive voice forms for the present tense. And the only difference being that there's no connecting vowel. So it's not like you're going to have to learn a whole new set of endings. And one thing to note as well, these are the perfect, middle, and passive indicative forms for the first perfect. In fact, the first perfect is the only set for the perfect tense form. There are no separate second perfect forms for middle and passive voice. And I've supplied again a translation for you, a gloss as we call it, for each of these forms. In the middle voice, you would say first person singular, I have loosed myself, or in some contexts you may want to just drop the self part of it there, the reflexive aspect, and in English you may just want to translate it as an active voice, I have loosed. Even though when you read it in Greek you'll understand that there's a self-interest involved there because it's middle voice in form. Passive voice would be I have been loosed. The action is done to me. And then the same pertains to the second person and the third person, singular and plural. Okay, having looked at the active, middle, and passive voice forms for the perfect indicative, let's look at the perfect infinitive form now of luo. And here you can see there are three voice forms, active, middle, and passive. Active voice, you see again the reduplication of the stem, and you see the kappa there as well. That will be true now for perfect infinitives in the active voice. So leluk enai is how that is pronounced, to have loosed. So again, it's an infinitive, so you would translate it to something normally. And in this case, because it's an action in the past, or normally understood to have been in the past. Again, infinitives aren't necessarily past, present, future. But in this case, you would normally understand it as something in the past, to have loosed, or middle voice, lelusthai, to have loosed oneself, or passive voice, lelusthai, and again, same form for middle and passive, but in the passive voice context, you would translate to have been loosed. And keep in mind that infinitives don't have person, first person, second person, third person. They don't have number, plural, or singular. And so these are the three forms that you'll want to use for first person, second person, third person subjects, or whether they're singular or plural. These will work for all of those combinations. Having looked at the perfect indicative forms as well as infinitive forms, now let's move on to the participle forms for the perfect. Here we have the perfect active participle form of luo, and you'll notice that it looks very similar to the perfect indicative forms except for the endings. You've got the stem, lu, and then you've got the reduplication before it, le, lambda epsilon. You've got the kappa perfect tense sign there for the active voice. The only difference seems to be the endings, lelukos, lelukatas, lelukati, lelukata, etc. And so for the masculine, feminine, and neuter participle forms, what they have for their case endings are a 3-1-3 pattern. In the case of the masculine, they use third declension noun endings. In the case of the feminine, they use first declension endings, and thus you see the alpha as characteristic there of several of those endings, most of them. And then for the neuter, whether singular or plural, again, it takes a third declension noun ending. So it has a 3-1-3 pattern for the perfect active participle form of luo. In fact, I'd recommend that you just take your textbook, and as you see the paradigm in your textbook, you write above each of the columns for the paradigm 3-1-3, so that is something that's a quick, easy reference for you. You can see at a glance which case endings or declension endings to use with the different case forms here. Moving on to the second perfect active participle form, this time for lepo instead of luo. Again, it looks very similar to the second perfect active indicative forms with the exception of the endings. In fact, the endings are the same for the second perfect as well as the first perfect participle forms. The difference being, of course, the root word that's involved and whether there's been a contraction between like lepo here to loip for the stem. But you'll notice again it has the same set of endings, and that's because it follows the same declension pattern. For masculine, they'll use third declension endings, feminine, first declension endings, and neuter, third declension endings. So again, you've got a 3-1-3 pattern for the second perfect active participle forms. Next we have the paradigm for the perfect middle and passive participle form, and in this case we're back to luo again as our root word. But you can see here again, same pattern. Lelu menas is the masculine form there in the upper left corner to begin with in our paradigm. One thing you'll notice besides the reduplication, besides the stem, again, no kappa when it comes to the middle and passive voice forms, and that's going to be true with the participle forms now too. The kappa drops out. That's something characteristic of the active voice. But when it comes to the endings for each of these columns, masculine, feminine, and neuter, you should be familiar with these endings already. Lelumenos, lelumenu, lelumeno, lelumenon, etc., lelumenoi, right on down the line. These should look familiar to you because they are in fact the endings for the participle, for the present, middle, and passive voice participles of luo. The only difference is the omicron connecting vowel has dropped out. And so you don't have to memorize whole new sets of endings. Now in this case, for the middle and passive participle of the perfect tense, it follows a 2-1-2 pattern. That means masculine follows second declension endings, feminine first declension endings, and neuter second declension endings. Having seen the perfect indicative forms as well as perfect participle forms and infinitive forms, let's move on to our vocabulary list now for lesson number 23 of our textbook, chapter 23 that is. And it's a short list this time, so we'll just run through this list, beginning with akuo, meaning I hear. That's its present tense form. To the right of that, in the right column, would be the perfect tense form. So you can see the change from the present to the perfect. So it would be changed into akekoa, akekoa. And some of these look very different from their original present tense form. And so you just have to be prepared for some of these changes. But you'll notice the kappa involved there. Not all of these words have a kappa, but some of them do. Most of them do, in fact. The next word down is baptizo, meaning I baptize, of course, and then bebaptismai, and that would be I have been baptized, understood as a passive voice in that case. Next on the list is ginomai, a very common word in the New Testament, meaning I become. And its perfect tense form would be gegona, I have become. Next on the list is gnosko, meaning I know. And a perfect tense form would be egnoka, I have known. And then grapho, I write. And to the right of that, the perfect tense form, gegrapha. And then deo, meaning I tie or bind. And then its perfect tense form, dedica, I have bound. Agidzo is the next word. I come near or approach. And then in its perfect tense form, you've got engika. Remember when you've got two gammas together like that, it forms an NG sound, like the word angel. We don't say engel, we say angel. So you want to pronounce this engika. I have come near is the idea. Next on the list is agero, meaning I raise up. and its perfect tense form would be ageigermai, ageigermai. You might say, well, this doesn't look like an active voice form. You're right, it's not. It's actually the middle and passive voice form. In this case, functioning's like a passive voice. You would translate this, I have been raised up. And in this case, the perfect tense active form does not appear in the New Testament, so you're learning a passive voice form. Next on the list is the word for I come or go. I come or go out of is the idea, with the prefix ex there, the preposition ek. So exerchomai, and the perfect tense form would be ex el lelutha, meaning, instead of I come or go, I have come or gone out of. And then we have erchomai, which is deponent again in its present tense form, I come or go. And in its perfect tense form, it would be allelutha, allelutha. Then you have luo, of course, and leluka. The next word down is oida as a perfect tense form, but it doesn't have a present tense form. It never appears as such. And you would understand this to mean I know or understand. You wouldn't say I have known, because the emphasis of oida, even though it's perfect tense in form, it functions as an active voice verb. I'll explain more about that a little later in this lesson. And then we have pistuo, the word for I believe. And then its perfect form is pepistuka, perfect tense form, I have believed. And then lastly, we have sozo, I save, or perfect tense form, sesoka, I have saved. Okay, moving on from our vocabulary list as well as our paradigms, we have, as I consider it, we have eaten our vegetables, and now we can move on to something that I think has a little more meaning and satisfaction to us, particularly how these verb forms function, or how we should interpret or understand them. To me, I find this far more interesting than learning the component parts to each of these verb forms. So now let's move on to the payoff here as far as our exegesis goes. How should we look at perfect tense form verbs? Well, here you have the aspect in this chart for previous verb forms that we have learned, present, imperfect, future, aorist. Now we're going to learn the perfect aspect. And I've saved this perfect aspect to this point because it's good for you to learn the other forms first and then come later with the perfect tense form. Because the aspect of the perfect is basically a combination of two previous tense form aspects that we've looked at. What the perfect tense verb is an action that occurs usually in past time, but it's a completed event. And so in terms of the action involved, it's perfective aspect because it looks back on an event that is complete, or an action that's been completed. So it's like the aorist in that regard, but you also add to that the present state that results from that past action. And so as you look at the present state, that is imperfective aspect. So what you're dealing with when it comes to a perfect tense aspect, or the aspect of the perfect tense verb, is something that is a combination of the aorist aspect as well as the present aspect. So you've got both past action that's completed, thus perfective aspect, as you would expect with the aorist, but then you've got a present or existing state that follows the action, and thus that functions like a present tense verb, which has imperfective aspect. So thus we could say that the aspect for the perfect tense is combinative. Some people like to call it a stative aspect, putting more of the emphasis on the resulting state of the past action. In other words, view it more like a present tense verb or verb form with imperfective aspect. In fact, one Greek grammarian, his name is Constantine Campbell, he prefers to call the aspect for the perfect tense form imperfective aspect. Others prefer to call it stative aspect. I prefer to call it combinative because in some uses of the perfect tense, as we'll see, the emphasis is on the past action. And in some uses, as we'll see, the emphasis is on the present result. And so it's best, I think, to combine those two and say it's a combinative aspect. If you're looking at the past action, the viewpoint on that is, again, perfective. It's been completed. If you're emphasizing or looking at the result that comes from that, the emphasis is on a present state. And so you would say it's more imperfective. So the phrase combinative combines both of those, and I think it's more encompassing and easier to remember. So as we look at perfect tense form verbs in 3D, especially as we think of indicative mood that incorporates time, we need to think in terms of aspect, time, and action start. Same is true with the perfect tense verbs forms as I've taught you with previous tense forms of verbs. Again, aspect for the perfect tense form is going to be a combinative aspect because perfect tense form deals with two parts: a past action that is viewed perfectively, an action viewed as complete or in its whole, as well as the present results from that past action viewed imperfectively, so combinative aspect. And we know, of course, that with Greek verbs, aspect is primary. Greek is an aspect prominent language. Time is not what's prominent. It's present, I believe, in verb forms in the indicative mood in terms of norms, as I explained in the last lesson, though there are exceptions to the norms, and we have to be careful with that. So perfect tense, in terms of time of action, really depends what is being emphasized. There is going to be a past action. So in terms of time, with the indicative perfect tense and indicative mood form, the time of the action will be in the past, but the resulting state from that action will be normally viewed as the present. So time, again, it depends on how the perfect tense form verb is being used in a particular context as to which of the two time elements is being emphasized. Sometimes it's the past action, sometimes it's the present state. When it's the past action, you'll want to translate or interpret it more as a past tense with verbs like, or added words like have or has, whereas when it's present resulting state being emphasized, you'll want to just simply use the word is and almost just translate it like a present tense verb. So time is secondary when it comes to Greek verbs. Same is true here with the perfect tense form. And the action start of a perfect tense verb, again, is going to vary depending on the context and depending on the particular type of verb that's involved. Is it a verb that's more continuous by its very nature, like the verb endure or persevere? Or is it something that is more punctiliar or even telic, that has a particular end in view, like words hit, die, crucified, finish, verbs like that. So that's aspect, time, and action start when it comes to perfect tense verbs. Here's an expanded explanation or definition of the perfect tense verb taken from a book by three men, Kestenberger, Merkel, and Plummer, Going Deeper with New Testament Greek. And here's what they explain about the perfect tense, that the perfect tense form, state of aspect, that's the term they like to use instead of combinative, but this tense form is often described as conveying a completed action in the past that has continuing results. That is, the action itself is no longer being performed, but the consequences of that action still exist in the present. And they clarify that. It's in the present in relation to the time of the author, not the time of the reader. Keep that in mind. So whoever's writing this, Luke or John or Paul, etc., it's from their standpoint. He goes on to say, or they say, thus gegraptai, the perfect of grapho, does not so much mean it is written as it stands written. The idea conveyed by the perfect is that what was written in the past has abiding consequences or implications for the recipients. They also go on to say this, and it's helpful. The aspect of the perfect is described as stative, which is used when the author wants to focus on the state of being that results from a previous action, a combination of the perfective and imperfective aspects. Hence, I prefer to call it combinative. They go on to say, others have described the perfect tense form as a combination of the aorist, completed action, perfective aspect, and the present, progressive nature, imperfective aspect, tense form. It is often the goal of the interpreter to determine which of these two features is being emphasized in a particular context. And that is very true. You'll see even in the examples that we're about to look at shortly that some of them emphasize the past completed action when you see a perfect tense form used, and some emphasize the present resulting state. And again, as an interpreter, you've got to be aware of context and the nature of that verb to determine which of the two is being emphasized by the use of the present tense or perfect tense form rather. I do want to mention as well that I would recommend if you're looking for a grammar book that gives greater explanation than our textbook, I would highly recommend this one. It's really an intermediate level Greek grammar that presents second year Greek level information. And this one really gets the issue of verbal aspect correct. It's one of the few books out there that are available now, the more are coming on the market, that deal with this subject accurately. So if you want, as part of your reference toolbox for the future, I would recommend purchasing this one. Another excellent Greek grammar book to have is by Daniel Wallace, called Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. Some call it an intermediate level Greek grammar. I don't think it is. It's more intermediate to advanced, but it is also an excellent reference to have for your future studies and doing exegesis. But he also says something here that's very helpful in his grammar book that's a clarification about a misunderstanding regarding the perfect tense. He says, even more misleading is the notion, frequently found in commentaries, that the perfect tense denotes permanent or eternal results. Such a statement is akin to saying, the aorist tense means once for all. Implications of this sort are to be drawn from considerations that are other than grammatical in nature. One must be careful not to read his or her theology into the syntax whenever it is convenient. And very true in saying that. Sometimes people emphasize with the perfect tense, wrongly, that it means completed action in past time with results continuing into the present, and hence they will continue past the present into the eternal future. Well, that's not what the perfect tense itself indicates. Context may indicate that, but not the grammar itself. So we have to be careful not to read too much into the perfect tense form. Now let's look at the perfect tense form and how it's used in different ways, having heard some explanations and qualifications about it from the two previous grammar books. A recent study was done by one scholar, and he categorized every use of the perfect tense form in the New Testament. And these are the results he came up with by way of percentage, that these different uses can be broken down into three main types of uses. Of course, if you were to take a second year or advanced level Greek grammar course, you would study multiple different kinds of action start uses depending on context and the nature of verbs, etc. But when it comes to just how perfect tense verbs are used in general, you can look at them in three different ways broadly. 54% of the time, this researcher found that the past action was involved, but the emphasis was on the resulting state. That's what was being emphasized. And if that's the case, and I gave you some examples there, Matthew 4:4, etc., we'll look at some of these in a moment. But when you see a case like this, you will want to supply in your interpretation or translation the present tense helping verbs is or are. Likewise, about 35% of the time, the emphasis is on the past action with its ongoing relevance. Not that the results of the action are what's being emphasized so much, or a resulting state per se, but the implications of the past action. So there's ongoing relevance, and we'll see some examples of that. In that case, you'll want to use the helping verbs has or have to bring out more of that past tense action. And then sometimes, 11% of the time, past action is being looked at holistically, almost like an aorist. In fact, you'll want to just translate it in some cases like an aorist. Now, as we think of that holistic perfective aspect, I should mention that all languages change over time. As you think of English, of course, just think of the great change that has occurred since the time of Shakespeare. And if you want to go even before Shakespeare, try reading the English story of Beowulf sometime. And very difficult to do, to understand that. And we're just talking here less than 1,000 years or so since that was composed. So languages change dramatically over time. What was happening in the Koine period of the 1st century was that the perfect tense form was already declining in usage, and it was beginning to merge in meaning with the aorist in some instances. And this was true in the New Testament as well as outside the New Testament. And in just a few more hundred years after the 1st century, by the time you get to what's called the Byzantine period, the perfect tense form drops out altogether from the Greek language. Was no longer there because it had just become redundant with the aorist. So the aorist was preserved, perfect tense form drops out, and I find that very interesting because in about 11% of New Testament cases, that seems to be the usage of the perfect tense, that it's almost synonymous with the aorist tense form. Now let's begin looking at some examples from New Testament verses to help clarify these 3 different broad types of uses for the perfect tense. The first example is from Matthew 4:4, where Jesus is in the wilderness being tempted. In fact, Satan comes to him, and Jesus answers him on 3 rounds or occasions with the Word of God. In Matthew 4:4 it says, "But he answered and said, 'It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God.'" And Jesus is quoting there, of course, from the Old Testament, the book of Deuteronomy. And he uses the perfect tense form here for grapho. Gegraptai is the perfect, passive, indicative, third-person singular form of grapho. And it's translated, "It is written." Notice the present tense emphasis. But there was a past action involved. It was written down in past time by Moses, who composed the book of Deuteronomy 1,500 years prior to Jesus Christ. But the emphasis is on the resulting state in the present. So it could be understood this way, that it stands written. And hence it's translated with the present tense emphasis in most translations, "It is written." But again, it involves a past action that is complete, hence the aspect for the past action would be perfective. That action is not still going on from the standpoint of Jesus, who's speaking here, or Matthew, who's writing it. That was an action 1,500 years prior, but it resulted in a present state that was still there at the time of Matthew and Jesus. And hence the aspect for the present state is imperfective. So this use of the perfect tense form constitutes, again, past action with resulting state. It constitutes over half of all perfect tense occurrences in the New Testament. And here we have a similar example as the previous one, where the perfect tense form is used, but the emphasis is on not just past action, but really the resulting state more so. And it's taken from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which is the great resurrection chapter of the Bible. And in verse 20 it says, "But now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the firstfruits of those who've fallen asleep." And that phrase "is risen" is agegartai, which is the perfect passive indicative third person singular form of agero, I raise up. But here, it's obvious Jesus Christ did rise in the past. There's no dispute about that. And the perfect tense does indicate that. But the emphasis seems to be on the resulting state from that past action. And how do we know that? Well, from the context and the word now, or nouni, in the original Greek sentence there, which is the word for now. And that clearly shows that the emphasis is again on the present state, that Christ presently is risen from the dead. He not only rose from the dead in the past, but he still is risen from the dead. That's the state he's in as Paul is writing this. So we've looked at a couple of examples of the perfect tense usage indicating not just past action, but more so the resulting present state. And now we're going to look at a couple of examples where we have the perfect tense used for past action with ongoing relevance. Not that the resulting state is what's emphasized, but the relevance, significance, implications of a past action are what's significant for the present. And here's an example from Acts chapter 6, verse 11, where it says regarding Stephen, who was martyred later in chapter 7 for his testimony, it says, "Then they secretly induced men to say, 'We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God.'" Here the phrase for heard, akekaamen, is the perfect active indicative form for akuo. And the emphasis seems to be here not so much on his past actions, or even the resulting state, but the implications of those past actions. We heard him say this in the past, hence there's a present problem. So the emphasis is on ongoing relevance. And this is the type of usage, again, that occurs about 35% of the time with all perfect tense occurrences in the New Testament. Here's another similar example of perfect tense usage for past action with ongoing relevance. This time it's taken from the Epistle of 1 John, a verse you're going to be translating very soon in your Greek studies. 1 John 1, verse 1. "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes," he goes on to say, "concerning the word of life." In other words, John was one of the apostles who heard Jesus firsthand, saw him with his very eyes, and he goes on to say, who our hands handled or touched. Remember when he rose from the dead, Thomas was told, "Put your finger right here in my side and feel the nail prints in my hand and see that it is I." So that's the context. And we have two verbs here that occur in the perfect tense form. The verb for akuo again, akekaamen, which again is the perfect active indicative first person plural form of akuo. And then the verb for see, horao, or rakaman, in this case, perfect active indicative first person plural of horao. But here we see that the past actions by the apostles of seeing and hearing are not a resulting state of being. That's not what's emphasized. He's not saying here, we have seen and we have heard, and that state of hearing and seeing continues up to the present. No, it's not saying that at all. Christ was gone at this point. In fact, John's probably writing around 90 AD or so. No, it's not the resulting state of a past action that's being emphasized as much as it is the ongoing relevance or implications of those past actions of seeing and hearing. So if John and the other apostles saw and heard Jesus like this in the past, the implication is that he really did come in the flesh. And so right off the bat here, in 1 John 1, the very beginning of the epistle, he contradicts this Antichrist doctrine that was prevalent at the end of the first century, known as Gnosticism, which denied that Jesus Christ really did come, or the Christ came in the flesh. Here's another example of the perfect tense usage for a past action with ongoing relevance, this time from the last epistle that Paul ever wrote, right before he was about to be martyred, 2 Timothy. He says in chapter 4, verse 7, "I have fought the good fight, I have kept finished the race, I've kept the faith. So clearly he's looking back in terms of reflecting retrospectively upon his Christian life as he knows he's about to be martyred. And so he uses here three perfect tense indicative mood verbs. I have fought is the perfect middle and passive deponent indicative mood form of agonizomai, agonismai. And then you have the second word there for I have finished, teteleka. That's the perfect active indicative of teleo. And then I have kept is tetereka, and that's the perfect active indicative of tereo. So three perfect tense verbs. And the emphasis here is not on the present resulting state from past actions, but on the relevance of those past completed actions. He had fought, he had finished, he had kept the faith. He's looking back. And now, in terms of relevance or consequence, he's about to receive a crown of righteousness as a reward for this perseverance in the faith. So clearly here, the emphasis is on significance or relevance, not so much a state. And I say that because some Greek scholars, like Constantine Campbell, want to translate 2 Timothy 4:7 as almost a present tense in its usage. He understands the perfect tense to be always imperfective, so this is how he translates it. I am fighting the good fight. I am finishing the race. I am keeping the faith. And while it's true that Paul fought the good fight right up to the end, he did finish the race, he crossed the finish line, he did keep the faith to the very end. It's true that he did that. It's just that when he's writing this in 2 Timothy 4, he knows that he's about to die and go home to be with the Lord. In fact, he's right there at the finish line. He's about to be martyred and pour out his life as a drink offering, he says. He knew that, but he's writing from the vantage point that it's here, it's arrived. I'm about to die. And so he's looking back retrospectively upon his entire Christian life. And so Campbell's translation here, I believe, misses the combinative aspect of the perfect tense, that the perfect tense is like an aorist plus a present. It's not strictly the present here. So we've seen examples of the perfect tense usage where it clearly emphasizes a resulting state from a past action. Sometimes it emphasizes an ongoing significance from that past action, but sometimes it just simply emphasizes the past action. And that's what we see here, where the perfect tense is almost used like an aorist, or it has that understanding. 2 Corinthians 2:13, Paul writes, again retrospectively on an event in the past, I had no rest in my spirit because I did not find Titus my brother, etc. So here he uses the perfect indicative form of the verb echo for I have, but here it's eskeka, and it's translated I had, past tense. But here the perfect tense cannot mean I had no rest in the past with the results continuing up to the present, I still don't have rest. Now that clearly is not the point. It's viewing a past action as complete, and it's not speaking about the present significance or present state of that past action. The past action is viewed holistically, so it's like an aorist indicative. And here's an example of the same, again from 2 Corinthians 11:25. 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day I have been in the deep. And that phrase, I have been, papoieka, is the perfect active indicative of poieo, normally translated I do. But here translated, I have been. So here in 2 Corinthians 11:25, again, the perfect tense cannot mean I had been in the past in the deep, in the sea, with the results continuing up to the present time I still am in the sea. Clearly it doesn't mean that, and it's not so much speaking about a past action with present significance or ongoing significance or relevance. No, it's just simply viewed here or used like an aorist almost, something that's strictly past. And again, this is one of those 11% minority of uses of the perfect tense form in the New Testament. So I just wanted to give you a couple of examples where the perfect tense form is used, but it's clearly not emphasizing present results or state or ongoing significance or relevance. It's just simply viewing an action in the past as complete, almost again like the aorist. And I say that because sometimes when you hear definitions for tense forms, as I've given you some clarifications or qualifications in the past, that the imperfect tense form doesn't always mean ongoing action in past time. Well, we can't say that the perfect tense always underscores present significance from a past action. I've just shown you two examples out of the 11% of all New Testament uses where the emphasis is clearly on the past action. But here we have in Romans 5 verse 2 a passage that uses the perfect tense form twice, and there's some disagreement as to how it should be translated. In fact, I've given you two translations there, the New King James Version and the English Standard Version. And notice how they interpret or translate the first usage of the perfect tense. New King James, through whom also we have presently access by faith into this grace in which we stand. The ESV translates, through him we have also obtained, past tense, access by faith into this grace in which we stand. Now there's no question about the second usage of histemi there for stand in the verse, in verse 2b. Both translated or understand it, the perfect tense there, as having present significance. And what's clearly implied is that we have stood in the past, but we are presently standing in this grace. But in the first part of the verse, there's some disagreement as to whether it should be viewed as past tense, like the ESV. We have obtained access. That would be that holistic perspective of the perfect tense. Or is it like the New King James Version that emphasizes the present resulting state? We have access. We had it in the past. We gained access in the past, but we still have resulting access by faith. And it could frankly be either one. It depends, again, on how people think this verse should be translated. But both aspects are true for that first usage there of echo, meaning I have in the perfect tense form, eskeikamen. Now, I want to clarify one of our vocabulary words. It's the word oida. It's the word for I know, but it's perfect tense in form, but in every case it is present tense in its function. And this is one of those idioms of the Greek language that you just have to mentally take note of and know by way of experience or usage as you read the New Testament, so that you don't misinterpret the significance of this. So for example, when you're doing your exegesis and you see this particular word and it tells you that it's, as you look it up grammatically, let's say, it tells you as you parse it that it's perfect tense form. You shouldn't interpret that to mean that it must be speaking of a past action with present significance or present state, etc. Because in this particular case, there is no present tense form, there's no imperfect tense form, there's no aorist tense form, there's no future tense form for oida. This particular verb only occurs, as it existed in first century Greek usage, in the perfect tense form and in the pluperfect tense form. It occurs in the New Testament 212 times in the perfect tense form, and in the pluperfect tense form 33 times. So again, when you see it, and you come across it like we have here in 2 Timothy 1:12, treat it as though it's present tense, even though it's perfect tense in form. And that's very clear in the context of 2 Timothy 1:12, where Paul writes, "For this reason I also suffer these things, nevertheless I'm not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep what I have committed to him in the past, by way of entrusting to him his eternal welfare, until that day." But here, by oida, he's not saying, "For I have known as an act in the past, with the results continuing to the present, that I still know." No, to interpret it that way would be incorrect. And I say that because sometimes that's how people have treated this particular verb. And so when it occurs in the perfect tense form, treat it as present tense. When you see it in the pluperfect tense form, which it does 33 times in the New Testament, you'll still want to parse it as pluperfect, but you'll want to translate it and interpret it as an aorist indicative. That's how it functions. And the same is true when you parse the verb oida, perfect tense form. You'll want to parse it as perfect tense grammatically, but you'll want to interpret it or translate it and understand that it's being used as present tense. Now let's go on to talk about or learn about perfect participles and time. We saw in previous lessons regarding the present, aorist, future tense participles that they all are used in relation to the time of the action of a main verb or main thought in a sentence or passage. With the present tense participles, they were simultaneous in their action to the action of the main verb. Aorist tense participles antecedent to the action of the main verb. Future tense participles subsequent to the action of the main verb. Now in the case of perfect tense participles, they are going to be, like the aorist, antecedent to the action of the main verb normally. And here is just one example of that, where we have the perfect tense participle for erchomai. In this case, it's translated has come in 1 John 4:2. Aleluthata. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God. So you've got three present tense verbs surrounding this one perfect tense verb. And so clearly Jesus Christ's coming was prior to knowing, confessing, or his being in the flesh as a present situation when John writes in the first century, probably about 90 AD. Jesus had already come in the flesh prior to that, and the perfect tense participle brings that out. So we've looked at the perfect tense, verb form, infinitive form, participle form, and usage. Now let's move on and we'll just briefly cover the pluperfect tense form. What is the pluperfect? Well, it's a combined type of tense, just like the perfect tense form. It speaks of a completed action in the past with a resulting state that continues for some time or did continue for some time in the past, but usually not up to the present. In fact, that's one of the things that distinguishes the pluperfect from the perfect, as we'll see. The perfect most often deals with a resulting state in the present, whereas the pluperfect normally deals with a resulting state limited to the past, again from the standpoint of the person writing, not you as a reader in the 20th century, of course, but from the writer in the first century when he originally wrote. Another point is the aspect of the pluperfect. Again, Greek being aspect prominent, this is what we need to think first about. The aspect, just like with the perfect, is going to be combinative. It will have perfective aspect for past action, but with an emphasis on existing imperfective state. But keep in mind that that imperfective state was in the past. So you've got two parts again to our understanding of this tense form, a past action and a resulting state. It's just that both the past action and the resulting state are in the past. So they're looked at as both past. Whereas perfect tense, it's past action with a resulting state that is most often in the present. And so that's the pluperfect tense form in terms of significance. So that's the meaning and significance of the pluperfect. Let's look at the formation of how the pluperfect active indicative appears. Here you see various parts for eleleukein. This is similar to leleuka. And so what you've got here for the pluperfect active indicative is you've got the stem, of course, lu, and then you've got a reduplication of the stem, lelu. You've got the kappa, perfect tense sign there, right in the pluperfect form. And then you've got an ending, ein in this case. But notice it's got an augment that prefixes it all. And that's, again, a past time marker. And I do believe that, along with imperfect tense, indicates that time is present in tense formation, in the indicative mood anyway, for Greek verbs, though it is secondary to aspect, as I explained in the last lesson. But here's how you form, then, the pluperfect active indicative. Here is the paradigm for the pluperfect active indicative of luo. So you've got the first person singular, eleleukein, I had loosed, is how you would translate that. And then you've got eleleukes, you had loosed, eleleuke, he, she, or it had loosed, etc. And you can just go right down the list. So here's the pluperfect active indicative form that occurs 79 times in the New Testament. We're going to skip the paradigm for pluperfect middle and passive voice forms because they only occur 7 times in the entire New Testament, only 7 times. And in all 7 times, they're only in the third person singular form, so there's really not much use for the entire paradigm for middle and passive. Here we have a usage of the pluperfect tense form in Acts 14, verse 23, where it says, so when they, Paul and Barnabas, had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Clearly here, the believing was prior to the appointment of elders and the praying and the commending of them. And so the pluperfect tense form is used to show a prior event with a resulting state in the past from the standpoint of the writer or narrator. In this case, it would be Luke, who's writing Acts. So when a narrator tells a story, and that story is already past in terms of the events it's describing, they're past in time, but when that narrator needs to describe something that took place prior to the narrative, he uses the pluperfect tense. And in this case, it's describing this previous action of believing here in this story. So the word for believe here is the pistuo, but it's in the pluperfect active indicative third person plural form, pepisteukesin. So you have one use here of the pluperfect tense. Again, past action with a past resulting state from the standpoint of the writer. Now that we've learned about all the tense forms for Greek verbs, including the perfect and the pluperfect, it's time to teach you something that is not found in your textbooks. It's the subject of periphrastic constructions. And I would encourage you to go ahead and write this information down somewhere in your textbook so you have it as a ready reference. And what is a periphrastic construction? These are very common in the Greek New Testament or language of first century Greek. They are roundabout ways of saying, in essence, the same thing. So if you wanted to have a present tense statement, another way to state that would be to use a present form of ami, the I am verb, and then combine it with a present participle And the resulting construction would be a present periphrastic construction. And likewise, you see present participles used with different forms of ame. Remember, ame can occur in its present indicative form, imperfect indicative form, or future indicative forms. But when you combine that with a present participle, it can be either a present periphrastic, imperfect periphrastic, or future periphrastic construction. Again, a periphrastic construction comes from the preposition there, peri, which means around or about. And so this is a roundabout way of saying, in essence, the same thing. It would just be another artistic way of stating something regarding a present or imperfect or future indicative. Now, when it comes to the perfect participle, that can be combined with present, imperfect, or future forms of ame. And when it does, it results in either a perfect tense, periphrastic type of construction that you just treat as though it's a perfect indicative statement, or a pluperfect periphrastic construction, or something known as a future perfect periphrastic. And I'll give you some examples here now. Here is an example from Hebrews 10, verse 10. By that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. The phrase "we have been sanctified" is the perfect tense passive voice participle of hagiadzo, and it's used in combination with esmen there, which is the present indicative first person plural of ame. And so what does it form when you have a perfect tense with a present form of ame? You've got a perfect periphrastic construction. It's just another way of stating something as a perfect tense. So you would translate it, we have been sanctified. The idea is we were sanctified in the past, and the results continue to the present. We are in a state of still being sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Here's another example of a perfect periphrastic construction that is from a great salvation verse that we all know as well, Ephesians 2:8. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. And here we have the perfect indicative form of ame, este, which is the second person plural form, combined with a perfect tense participle, sesosmenoi, which is perfect tense passive voice of sozo. And so when you've got a present indicative of ame combined with a perfect tense participle, it forms a perfect periphrastic construction, which should be treated just like a perfect tense verb by itself. Again, this is another roundabout way of saying, in essence, the same thing as just using a perfect indicative verb, sozo. Now, one other subject I want to introduce to you that's going to be helpful for you when it comes to exegesis or how you interpret the New Testament is the subject of grounding and prominence. And when I speak of grounding, I mean within a story, you've got different layers. Think of things in terms of depth perception. As you would view a scene, let's say, you've got things in the foreground, you've got things in the background, and you've got things that are right in front of you, front and center, in terms of front ground, if you will, to use that expression. Now that we've looked at all the tense forms again, and you've learned about perfect tense, it's time to introduce you to the subject of grounding or prominence. When an aorist tense form is used many times in discourse, it doesn't have major significance in terms of why it's used. In fact, it's so common, it's the most commonly found form with the present tense, that it just doesn't have a whole lot of significance. You shouldn't be reading, let's say, the book of Acts, and you see all these different uses of the aorist tense, and that they must have some deep theological meaning. No, it's more likely that the writer is just giving you a lot of background information or events to develop the storyline. And sometimes an imperfect tense form of a verb will be thrown in there, and that too provides background information, but it's considered as extra or additional information to what the aorist tense provides. And then when you come to the use of the present tense in a narrative setting like that, this often is used to provide important information that is brought to the foreground. So it's zooming in a little bit on information that's more front and center in terms of the storyline. But then when you've got the perfect tense form, that's where the writer or speaker is often trying to really focus your attention on something being in the very forefront of the story, or to coin a phrase, in the front ground. So think of, again, adjusting lenses to focus, to zoom in or zoom out on a setting. You've got things more in the background, the larger context. Aorist is often used for that. Sprinkle in some imperfects, and you've got some additional information for that background. The present tense kind of zooms you into what's happening more right in front of you, foreground information or material, whereas the perfect tense really focuses you on something in the very front ground. So that's what I mean by grounding and prominence. Now, as we look at this chart, this bar chart here, or graph in 3D, it's helpful to compare the number of occurrences of one tense form versus another. And this comes from Daniel Wallace's Greek grammar book, Beyond the Basics. And you can see the present tense form across the bottom and the aorist tense form are the most frequently used, especially in the indicative mood, as well as in the participle forms. So in the back corner of that graph or chart, you see the highest buildings, if you will. It's almost like a little city. But you'll notice to the far right end of the bottom there, perfect and pluperfect, they are the least frequent occurring tense forms in the New Testament. And it's true, as you look at all of Greek literature around the first century when the New Testament was written, that perfect tense and pluperfect were rare in comparison to the other tense forms. But most Greek grammarians have come to the conclusion that the tense form of the perfect, when it occurs, it is significant. In other words, because the writers had all these different choices of ways to express something. They could have used the aorist, present tense, imperfect, future, etc. But why did they choose to use the perfect tense? Well, because it's used so infrequently. When it is used, it often has significance. And I'll give you an example, a couple of examples in our next slides. Here's an example of this idea of grounding and prominence that uses the perfect tense form to really make an emphasis on a particular point. We also know this passage well. It's one of the key salvation passages in the New Testament that defines the gospel. Paul writes, "For I delivered to you, first of all, that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures." And I've highlighted in yellow for you 3 aorist tense forms of verbs. But then, in contrast to that background information, what is the thing that is most prominent? Well, it's highlighted there in purple, the idea of his resurrection, that he rose, agegertai, which is the perfect tense form of agero. And what is the focal point of chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians? It's the resurrection. In fact, we know that several times the perfect tense is used later in the chapter to again highlight this point that Jesus Christ completed an action in the past that has present significance today. But I think also from the standpoint of writing, he's using this to emphasize not merely the nature of Christ continuing to be in a raised state, but also here from the standpoint of contrasting it with these aorists to really highlight the main point he's trying to make in the passage. The last example I'd like to use is from Acts chapter 16, where there are multiple different tense forms that are used, and I've color-coded them again to make it clear and easy to see the distinction. But this passage in Acts 16 deals with Paul and Silas being in Philippi, and they're in jail, and the Philippian jailer ends up getting saved in the process. And so let's just go through the passage and note again the different tense forms that are used, and you'll note how rare the perfect tense is throughout this account. Aorist is most common. You've also got some present and imperfects sprinkled in there and an occasional future. But the point is that the perfect tense form, when it is used here to draw the attention to a main point he's trying to make in the narrative. This account begins in verse 25. But at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. So you've got praying there, which is present tense, singing and listening, which are imperfect tense. That helps draw your attention into the story to bring you more up front and center to what's going on with imperfective aspect. Next, we have some more background information in verse 26. Suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were open, and everyone's chains were loosed. So all that is aorist tense, stating facts, giving you background information. Now we have a couple of perfects used to, again, really bring a couple of points to the forefront of the story. And the keeper of the prison, awaking from sleep and seeing the prison doors open, supposing the prisoners had fled, drew his sword and was about to kill himself. Now it's true that open doors and fled prisoners help form the main point of this story. It's not just background information, but it's prominent information that's going to lead to the unfolding of this story that helps set the context again for this Philippian jailer getting saved. But again, you've got three uses of the aorist there, nothing too significant to read into those. The one use of the present, and in this verse, a couple uses of the perfect. Now the perfect's going to go away for a while and reappear at the end of our account, or pericope as it's sometimes called. Verse 28, but Paul called with a loud voice, saying, do yourself no harm, for we are all here. Again, aorist and presents combined. Verse 29, then he called for a light, ran in, and fell down, trembling before Paul and Silas. Again, all aorists here, so we shouldn't read anything super significant in terms of why this is an aorist here. He's just stating a number of facts. Verse 30, and he brought them out and said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? So again, three aorists and one present tense there that seems to be bringing something to the foreground. What must I do to be saved? Verse 31, so they said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved, you and your household. Now, you might say, well, I thought the aorist was used for something that was background information. And here, it seems to be a major point that he says, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. We use this verse as a major evangelistic verse in our everyday usage. That's true, it is. But we're going to see he builds to the point where believe is emphasized later in this story as it concludes. And that's what he wants you to see as the main point of this whole story. And this is one part of that main point in verse 31. Verse 32, then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. Again, aorist background information. Verse 33, and he took them the same hour of the night and washed their stripes, and immediately he and all his family were baptized. So took, washed, and baptized, all aorist, and thus they're all in yellow. Again, giving you important information, but it's background in contrast to his main point, which is in verse 34. Now, when he had brought them into his house, he set food before them, and he rejoiced, having believed, a perfect participle in God with all his household. So this perfect tense is used at the very end of this account of Paul and Silas in the jail in Philippi and the Philippian jailer getting saved. And it's used to, again, put something at the very forefront of our thinking. What is the main point of this whole story here? It's that the Philippian jailer and his house believed, and they were saved, and they were rejoicing in the Lord. They had become believers. That's the main point. So it's helpful sometimes to see, by way of contrast, the perfect tense used here with a number of aorists and a number of present tense and imperfect, but the limited usage of the perfect tense in an account like this shows you that when it is used, it's used to highlight or make prominent a key point. In this case, the summarizing main point of the whole episode of the Philippian jailer getting saved. They became believers. And that concludes our lesson on the perfect and pluperfect tenses.